Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, and I'm continuing my series about the Irish oppression myth. Irish Republicans like to traduce the British Army and say it has a dreadful record, or they would summarise its experience in Ireland as being brutal, which is very far from the truth. Now, obviously, the British Army's record is not perfect, that of no army is. So, in an armed conflict, obviously, armies are entitled to kill their enemies in combat. Now, when the British Army was fighting the IRA and its antecedents, these were irregular conflicts most of the time. And this obviously makes things much more complicated because the insurgents, to use a neutral term, were usually not wearing uniforms, so couldn't be identified, mingling with the civilian population. Difficult to tell who's who, meaning it was more likely to be there would be a case of mistaken identity and the wrong people killed and things like that. By not wearing a uniform, people put themselves outside the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Conventions date back to 1890s, if I've got that right. And prior to that, people who were rebels rather than soldiers of a recognised army, in the laws of every country, were considered to be traitors and could be executed. But usually in Ireland they were not. They got terms of imprisonment, sometimes incredibly leniently treated. 1803 was the last time that the Crown was quite firm about these things. But bear in mind, if we go back over 200 years, the death penalty was used quite promiscuously. People could be executed for grand larceny. And not all was executed in a straightforward way, like just simply being hanged or shot, but executed in quite gruesome ways. Not saying in Ireland we were anything unusual like that. So life was cheap. These were dark and harsh times. When you look at it from 1848 onwards, very few people executed, often transported to Australia, often released after a few years. Likewise, the 1867 rebellion and so forth. So after the 1798 rebellion, when's the next time civilians were killed by the British Army? 1803, Robert Emmet's street brawl. I'm not sure that any civilians were killed by the Crown forces there. They were killed by Robert Emmet's men. Let me see, 1848, any time up to then, so far as I know, none. And actually I think the Royal Irish Constabulary, as it was in those days, the Irish Constabulary dealt with the Young Irelanders, their revolt. 1867, I'm not aware of a single civilian who was killed by the Crown forces then, the Army or the Irish Constabulary. Then as after that, the police got the prefix Royal, became Royal Irish Constabulary. So go on, sometimes there was disorder and times of heightened tensions in the 1880s. I think there was a time when 3 people were killed, but I think it was by the police rather than the army. So the RIC was overwhelmingly Irish, and incidentally, overwhelmingly Catholic. The RIC was more Catholic than the general population. At a time when the population was something like 75% Catholic, the RIC was 85% Catholic. So if there was sectarian discrimination, it was towards Catholics and against Protestants by the state. And then, let me see, 1916, all right, here, for the first time that I know of, in over a century, there were some civilians killed by the British Army. So there were thousands of soldiers in Dublin putting down the Easter Rising, maybe even tens of thousands by the end. And obviously this is a city of almost 500,000 people at that time, and there are bullets flying in all directions. So mistakes will be made. It's the Irish volunteers chose to fight in a very built-up area, which inevitably means civilian casualties. Likewise, the Irish volunteers killing civilians. Deliberately killing civilians, not that I'm aware of at that time. So I think I read something about Maurice Headlam, his Memories of Ireland. He does mention, I think, some former soldiers were killed by the IRA, were civilians at the time. But there were times when British soldiers deliberately killed civilians in Dublin, knowing them to be civilians, and that's murder, right? Sometimes there were occasions when it was an accident, they were fired out from a certain direction, the soldiers fired back in that direction, and they hit somebody, but it wasn't the person firing at them, it was a civilian. Or it was dark, they saw a figure, they thought he had a gun, they opened fire, turned out not to be a gun, to be a broom, and things like that. So there were some honest mistakes, but there were some crimes as well. And there was Captain Bowen Colthurst who was prosecuted. So, especially by the standards of the time, and considering how many people were involved, it was really a minimal number of people who were deliberately killed by the army. So, no, the army's record is not entirely blameless. But what Republicans will do, they'll focus on a few very unusual incidents and try and blow this out of all proportion. Of course, ideally, no civilians would be killed by the army, particularly not deliberately killed. But we have to expect it. It's going to happen if we're honest about it. This has happened in all armies, and these soldiers are in stressful situations, feeling is running high, they see red, and these sort of things happen. And then we go on to the conflict of 1919 to 21. And this really is an irregular conflict, the IRA almost never wearing uniform. Lord Montgomery of Alamein, he served in this campaign, and he said these irregular conflicts, they tend to lower standards of chivalry. Soldiers in a regular conflict, let's say they were fighting on the Western Front between the Allies and the Germans, they tend to perceive each other as soldiers and to usually behave honourably. Even then there's some war crimes. But when they're fighting against insurgents and not wearing uniforms and things like that, and seem not to play by the rules, then they're less likely to be merciful when they capture them. But anyway, that's slightly different because I'm mainly talking about civilians. But even so, did the army or the IUC, did they deliberately kill IRA prisoners when they caught them? I'm not talking about being tried and judicially executed. Yes, there were a very few times when IRA men were captured and then killed. But over 20,000 IRA men were interned at this time. How many were killed extrajudicially? It's in the tens, if that. So it's a tiny proportion of those who were captured. So again, we have to be fair-minded about this and expect that no army's record is going to be absolutely above criticism. But overall, it was very, very good indeed. The majority of them did not do this. Or likewise, torturing prisoners. Now, the Essex Regiment allegedly tortured is about 4 people who Tom Barry mentions, and that was the real cockpit of IRA activity. Nowhere was more violent than West Cork at that time. And if even in that area, if even the most prejudiced person, Tom Barry, says only 4 people were tortured, then this really is not a bad record at all. So, yeah, they had to search people's houses. They were not always polite. And I don't think they're angels. I don't always give them a pass. All sorts of people get into the army, some of them morally good, most of them mixed, and a few of them bad, a few of them former criminals. Often their minds had gone through torture in the First World War. They had these facial tics and had post-traumatic stress disorder, which partly explains some of their sometimes less than honourable conduct. But anyway, so we just have to be realistic and see it in context. And then, often dealing with the IRA was the RIC or then the Royal Ulster Constabulary, not the army. There was a Bachelor's Walk incident in July 1914, which I omitted. So that's when the Irish volunteers illegally imported weapons, Mausers from Germany. It was about a week before the First World War broke out, that Sunday, and the army tried to intercept them. They didn't get them. The Irish volunteers got their guns away. Then some of the soldiers marching back to the centre of Dublin were stoned by the crowd, repeatedly stoned. Now stones can kill, they can and do kill. And even if they don't kill, they cause other injuries. They could blind someone, they could cause concussion. And the soldiers eventually couldn't take this and were obliged to defend themselves. How many stones would you allow to be thrown at your head before you did something about it? Now, whether you support the Crown Forces or not, this is a reasonable thing to do. You could raise your rifle, threaten, fire in the air. If this is not working, eventually you're going to have to fire at the person who's doing it. And they might miss and fire at somebody who wasn't throwing, somebody beside him. So 3 civilians were killed at Bachelor's Walk in Dublin. Now, several soldiers have been injured before that happened. And that's obviously the fault of those who were stoning the crowd. If the soldiers don't do that, they're going to be more and more stoned. They could be attacked, overpowered by a mob, their guns turned against them, things like that. But this is always what Republicans are saying. The soldiers got to get killed and then defend themselves. So I don't have a rose-tinctured view of British soldiers. Some of them are wicked and loathsome. Some of them are ex-criminals. But I don't demonise them as a whole, as some do, because they have a political agenda to pursue. And no, I'm not a blind defender of them. Where they've done wrong, I have stated that plainly. So really, no conflict between the IRA and the British Army. Oddly, in the Second World War, the IRA were attacking the IUC. In the 1950s, they were attacking the IUC. There were British Army targets there. They did nothing about it. Shows how feeble the IRA were. Far more into killing Irish people than they were soldiers from Great Britain. And then obviously in the 70s, it started again. The IRA managed to kill the first soldiers they'd done for 50 years. And again, of 3,500 people killed in the Ulster conflict, how many were civilians killed by the British Army? I think very, very few. It's in the dozens, which is still too high. Ideally, it'd be none. We don't even need to talk about the 30th of January 1972. That's very well known. So that was plainly a disgraceful incident. We finally got to the bottom of it. And I had read the Widgery report, which I found fairly convincing at the time. It's quite detailed, especially considering it was quite rushed, done in only about 3 months. And of course, tensions were very high. There was huge pressure on people to say this or that. And some things came out in that which redounded to the favour of the parachute regiment, to the disfavour of the IRA, came out in the Savile report much later. But yeah, Widgery was not exhaustive, was not entirely fair and balanced, was too slanted towards a parachute regiment. The Savile report I haven't read because it's so voluminous, but it's authoritative. Perhaps not completely flawless, but close to it. So yeah, that's that. I accept that there was wrongdoing by the British Army, but to try and summarise it as horrific, as cruel, as oppressive, as murderous, or something like that, it would be a travesty of the truth. Last time there was a significant number of civilians killed by the army would be way back in 1798, which is of course shameful, and no one should deliberately kill civilians like that. The British Army had its own disciplinary processes, courts martial and so on. And I think in the Troubles they should have been used more often, like say 1972, the Ballymurphy massacre, 10 people shot dead in 10 separate incidents in West Belfast over a weekend, and I think none of those killed was armed. So I have to go into the particulars of all those. But yeah, sometimes there was wrongdoing by the army, including murder, but people exaggerate the scale of it or act as though this is not to be expected. Unfortunately, I wish it weren't in these cases. So looking at the situation in the round, on balance, the record of the British Army is pretty good. Can anybody think of a conflict on a similar scale, an irregular, often urban conflict, where an army behaved better than the British Army?